My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. Well, I've been sharing with you the direct connection between the doctrine of martyrdom and suffering and resurrection. And what I want to do in this video is kind of bring that study down to a close so that we can get back directly to Romans 8 and 1 Corinthians 15. But I have to tell you, I believe that it is impossible to overemphasize this connection. Remember now, Romans 8 and 1 Corinthians 15 are directly parallel in their discussion of the resurrection. Well, in Romans 8, Paul said, I reckon that the suffering of this present time is not worthy to be compared with the glory that is about to be revealed in us. And he speaks of that urgent looking for, longing for, expectation for the manifestation of the sons of God at the time of the resurrection. So, suffering and martyrdom, resurrection go hand in hand. Let's walk through a few of the New Testament passages that I've already shared with you, but I want to do this quick summary to drive home this connection between suffering and martyrdom and the coming vindication at the day of the Lord, at the time of the judgment, at the time of the resurrection, at the time of the judgment of Israel. Let's begin where I think is absolutely the foundational text to talk about suffering, martyrdom, and resurrection. In Matthew chapter 23, Jesus stood in the temple, and he castigated the Jews on that occasion, and he said, which of the prophets have you not slain? He speaks of their long internecine history of killing the prophets. And he said, fill up then the measure of your father's guilt. Behold, I send to you wise men and scribes. In Luke 11:49 and following, he adds, I send to you apostles and prophets, wise men and scribes. Some of them you shall crucify and scourge and chase from city to city, that upon you may come all of the righteous blood of all of the righteous shed on the earth, from righteous Abel unto Zacharias son of Barachias, whom you slew between the temple and the altar. Verily I say unto you, all of these things will come upon this generation. Nothing could be clearer, nothing could be more definitive. Jesus said that the vindication of all of the martyrs, what is that? That's the judgment of the dead, would be brought upon that generation. That's the living. We thus have in Matthew 23 the judgment of the living and the dead. It would occur in that generation, and it would occur in the judgment of Jerusalem. You know, folks, I could stop right there. This passage is so definitive in laying out the paradigm for the topic of suffering and martyrdom and vindication and judgment, the judgment of the living and the dead. But of course we can't stop there. We look at Romans chapter 8, and Paul said, if you are children of God, then you are heirs, and you are heirs of Jesus Christ, if so be that we suffer with him, we shall also be glorified with him. Do you see? Suffering, martyrdom, glorification. When was that coming? In just a little while. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul talks about resurrection. And he said, if the dead ones are not raised, then why am I in peril every hour? Why did I suffer like I did at Ephesus? 1 Corinthians 15, 30 and 31. Here is Paul talking about his suffering as an apostle in light of the resurrection. 2 Corinthians chapter 4. Our light affliction, Greek word thalipsis, which is for a moment. See, it's a short time. Works in us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. We do not look at the things that are seen, but at the things that are unseen. The things that are seen are temporary. The things that are unseen are eternal. What are those unseen things that Paul was talking about? By the way, do you notice the nature of the resurrection that he's talking about? We do not look at the things that are seen. We are looking for that which is unseen. He's talking about the resurrection. It would not be a visible event. So here we have suffering and martyrdom, but only for a little while, until the resurrection. Now look, we could go to James, be patient, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. They were being oppressed, they were being persecuted. The coming of the Lord draws nigh. 1 Peter, we looked at 1 Peter very carefully. And now Peter is talking to them and saying they only had to suffer for a little while. And the end of all things was near, had drawn near. The judgment of the living and the dead was at hand. The time had arrived for the judgment of the living and the dead. 1 Peter 4, verses 5 to 17. And we've looked at Revelation. By the way, I'm leaving verses out. Oh, I've just got to get this. Hebrews chapter 10, the writer says, call to mind, after you were first illuminated, you were first converted, you endured a great fight of afflictions against yourself, partly by reproach and partly by those who confiscated your goods. In this you rejoice, knowing that you have in heaven a better and an enduring substance. But what did he say in verse 37? And now, in a very, very little while, the one who is coming will come and will not delay. Suffering and martyrdom, the promise of imminent vindication without delay. By the way, in Hebrews chapter 11, we have the reiteration of the format of Matthew chapter 23. Just like Jesus talked about Adam and martyrdom, Hebrews chapter 11, Adam and martyrdom. Just like Jesus marched forward about all of the blood of all of the righteous, on right down through Moses, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, all the way to Moses. Guess what? Here is Hebrews chapter 11, talking about the same thing. And they were looking for their eternal reward, the heavenly city, the heavenly country, and it was about to come because they had arrived. They were at Mount Zion. They were in the process of receiving the everlasting kingdom at that very time. Suffering and martyrdom of all the righteous, all the way back. Oh, and by the way, they, all of the dead, without us, that's the living, could not be made perfect. That's the judgment of the living and the dead. And we've talked about Revelation. Look, there is absolutely no way to avoid or to properly ignore the inextricable connection between suffering and martyrdom and judgment, the coming of the Lord, and the resurrection. And when we see that Jesus, Paul, James, Peter, and John all said that vindication was coming very soon. It was at hand. It had drawn nigh. And when Jesus declared, behold, I come quickly. Honestly, that should settle the issue. The resurrection would be the time of the vindication of all of the blood of all of the martyrs. And that occurred in AD 70. Let me remind you to get a copy of Sam Dawson's book, Revelation Realized. This is a comprehensive look at suffering and martyrdom in the light of resurrection eschatology. He starts with Adam, just where Jesus did. Go to my website, DonKPreston.com, BibleProphecy.com, and order this book, Revelation Realized. You will be absolutely amazed at how comprehensive and how clear the evidence is that the resurrection would be the time when Matthew 23 would be fulfilled in AD 70.